I wanted to talk to you about a few course administration matters, and then I'll speak just briefly about the last 3 chapters of the Stein book. You all did extremely well on the midterm. I was very pleased about that. It seemed like that you're really learning the material, and so I appreciate that. Keep up the good work, and you'll be fine in the end of the course. The writing assignments are a little tougher grade-wise than the midterm and the final will be, but don't be discouraged by that. This writing assignment coming up, which I'll talk to you about in a minute, I'm going to put up a rubric where you can see in advance what you'll be graded by, and I hope that this writing assignment might be a little more conducive to high grades than the last one. But even if you feel like your grades are low on the writing assignments, don't worry, because in the end, if we need to scale the grades up a little bit at the end of the course, I will. The most important thing is that you learn, and sometimes I think the best way to do that is by getting some good, meaningful feedback, even if your grade's a little lower on writing assignments. But very good work on the midterm. About writing assignment 2, the syllabus says it's due this week, but I'm going to bump that back to next week, and you'll see that assignment appear on Moodle Rooms very soon, probably about the same time this video is put on Moodle Rooms. But basically the assignment is this. I want you to look at Isaiah chapter 22. Not Isaiah chapter 22, Isaiah chapter 13. And it has 22 verses. Isaiah chapter 13. I want you to look at that and then tell me the meaning of that passage and as many implications as you can think of. And by meaning and implications, I'm using Stein's vocabulary. So you're going to want to go back to the beginning of the Stein book, review what he means by meaning and implications, and then write the meaning and as many implications as you can of Isaiah 13. My advice to you is to not really put an introduction of any kind, especially not a flowery one. This is another 1,000-word assignment, and the first paragraph, I want you to tell me the meaning of the passage. Just spend 1 paragraph on the meaning, and then for the rest of the assignment, just list as many implications as you can. Explain as you need to, but there doesn't need to be long, drawn-out explanation as long as I can understand what you mean by this implication and how you're drawing it from the text. This is an opportunity for you to apply some of the things that we've learned and demonstrate your ability to do that with a specific passage. More details will be coming as I post the assignment on our course site, but this ought to get you started. I think I said this already, but it'll be a 1,000-word assignment, so please do stick to that and just as much as you can fit in 1,000 words. Let's talk a little bit about the literary forms that were in your Stein reading assignment for this week. First of all, parables. A parable is a fictional literary form. And that's important to remember, first of all, that it's fiction. And then, secondly, generally a parable is a simple story with one basic point. Now, I do want to say that there are exceptions to both of these rules I just said, but they are general rules. Maybe I should say to the first rule there are possibly exceptions. A parable is a fictional literary form. The one possible exception that comes to my mind is the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. You remember this one where Jesus tells in Luke about Lazarus, the beggar who laid by the side of the road, and the rich man passed him by regularly and didn't help him, and then Lazarus goes to Abraham's bosom and the rich man goes to hell. And there's much discussion between scholars as to whether this is a true story or whether this is a fictional parable. So I mention that as the exception, the potential exception to the rule that parables are fictional stories. But by and large, and possibly in all cases in the Bible, a parable is a fictional story, and it has one basic point generally. Some of the interpretive difficulties that we get into with parables come because people try to read into a parable more than the author intended to put in the parable. If you understand what this genre of literature is about, it'll make your life much easier. And you won't have to worry about finding the meaning of every detail of the parable. You can focus on more the big picture. What does this parable mean overall? Because that's how the author intended for you to look at it, most likely. There are some exceptions to this rule that a parable generally has one point. Think of the parable of the soils in Mark chapter 4. That's not the only place it appears in the Gospels, but in Mark chapter 4, Jesus talks about 4 kinds of soil that seed fell on. And he goes on to explain that these 4 kinds of soils represent 4 different conditions of the heart that people have when they receive the Word of God. That's obviously a parable that does not just have one simple point. There are several layers to it. Another possible exception to the rule of one simple point is the prodigal son. As I think about those parables there in Luke chapter 15, the prodigal son is the last in a series of parables where Jesus is explaining why he eats with the tax gatherers and sinners. He tells the parable of the lost coin and the lost sheep, and the point of those both seems to be clearly that God, that like a woman will go after a lost coin in her house with everything that she has, and like a shepherd will go after a lost sheep with everything that he has, so God goes after one lost sinner with abandon and passion and love. When you get to the prodigal son, that point still seems to be present. The father will care about the prodigal son with passionate love, and he would go to great measures to get this son to come back. But then also there's the added message that Stein points out about the older brother, and the older brother represents the Pharisees and the scribes who hate the idea of Jesus eating with tax gatherers and sinners. So in the prodigal son, as I look at it, it seems like there are 2 points. The father's love for the lost sinner, but then also the Pharisees' wrong attitude toward the father going after sinners through his son. So those couple of parables, the soils and the prodigal son, seem to have multiple lessons. But I mention them not to illustrate the norm, but to illustrate the exception. If we just picked up our Bibles and thumbed to a random parable in the Gospels, we're more than likely going to have to interpret that as a simple story with a simple point. So do file that away. Now let's talk about exaggeration a little bit. Stein, at least in the 2011 edition, talks about overstatement and hyperbole as 2 forms of exaggeration. Overstatement is where something is exaggerated but possible technically, and hyperbole is where something is exaggerated and it's literally impossible. As Stein points out, it's not really all that important to distinguish between overstatement and hyperbole, but it is good to know that he's using those terms to refer to 2 different kinds of exaggeration. As I'm remembering, in the 1994 edition, he may just talk about hyperbole, but still, the rules in the chapter apply, just like they do in this 2011 edition. The Bible obviously does use exaggeration. You may think at first, well, that seems wrong. The exaggeration is dishonest. How can the Bible use exaggeration? Well, exaggeration is not inherently dishonest. In fact, we use exaggeration all the time, and it is an effective form of communication when the person speaking or writing it and the person hearing it understand that exaggeration is being used. I might say, I went to a doctor's appointment and the doctor made me wait forever before he saw me. I think that's probably, when it's understood by both parties to be exaggeration, a more effective way of communicating something than if I said I went to the doctor's office and I had to wait for 35 minutes before he saw me. And the Bible operates on that same principle, that sometimes exaggeration or overstatement is a more effective way to communicate a truth with emotional punch than just making a simple statement of fact. One example of overstatement in the Bible is in Matthew chapter 5, verses 28 through 30. I'll read it to you. But I say to you, this is Jesus speaking in the Sermon on the Mount, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better that you lose one of your members than that your whole body go into hell. Some people have taken these commands literally through church history and mutilated themselves. But it doesn't take a whole lot of thinking about it to realize that Jesus is speaking in exaggeration. He's talking about lust. But it's evident that gouging out your eye or cutting off your hand will not necessarily deal with the problem of lust. What Jesus is saying is he's using an overstatement to make the point powerfully that whatever you have to do to flee sin, you do it. Now, if it were possible to avoid some sin by cutting off your hand or gouging out your eye, then we might think about that. But in this case, that doesn't necessarily stop the sin. And so we know that Jesus is using a form of exaggerated speech to make a point with more emotional impact than had he just said, take whatever measures are necessary in order not to commit the sin of lust. It's a serious thing, and Jesus says, flee from it in the strongest terms. It's in situations like that where exaggeration is a very useful form of literature in the Bible. There are others that Stein brings up, and the most important thing I would say to you about exaggeration is look at Stein's rules for recognizing exaggeration an overstatement of any kind. These are very good rules, and I'm going to test you on them on the final exam. So make sure you have these committed to memory. They won't only be useful for your exam in this class, but these will serve you extremely well for a lifetime of studying the Bible. Now finally, Stein talks about correspondence as a form of literature. Really, correspondence, or letters, is one of the easiest Bible forms to interpret because it's so straightforward. Nevertheless, we do need to recognize the letters of the epistles as a literary form. It's not just that Paul and Peter and James and John, the author of Hebrews, sat down and wrote with no outline or idea as to what they were doing. There is a form, a literary form to a letter. And while different epistles vary a little bit in what parts of that form they use, they all do assume this literary form that is a letter. And if we know what a first century letter looked like, that'll help us a whole lot in interpreting books like Romans and Philippians and 1 John and 2 John and 3 John. So there's not a whole lot that you have to learn or memorize, but do take a look at the portion of the Stein book where he talks about the form of a first century letter. It will shed some light on the epistles. In the epistles, understanding words and phrases becomes very important. It's important everywhere in the Bible, but when talking about epistles, this is a good place to highlight it, because often we don't have to worry about symbolic speech. We don't have to worry about poetry. It's just a plain, straightforward statement of what the author wants to say. And it's a place where we'll very often be well served in our Bible study to look up the meaning of individual words and figure out how the author's using those words. So I want to talk to you for just a minute about how we can determine what a word in the Bible means. One of your best tools, and your first tool, should be a dictionary. A Bible dictionary will tell you all the possible meanings for one word. But keep in mind that just because a word has 6 possible definitions, that doesn't mean that the author intends all 6 of those meanings in one instance that he uses a certain word in the book of 1 Corinthians, for instance. So after you look up a word and see all its possible meanings, the task is to determine what specific meaning the author was giving that word in the passage that you're reading. A great way to determine that is, first of all, to look at the other books that this author has written, the other biblical books, and see how he used the word in question in that book. If Paul tends to use the word righteousness to mean one specific thing, that'll help you know how he's using the word righteousness in Romans chapter 3, for instance. Then after you look at how an author uses a specific word in the rest of that book, look at how the author uses that word in all the other books that he wrote. That'll help you. After that, look at how other authors of similar Bible books use that word. After that, look at how, if you're looking at a Greek word in the New Testament, look at how the entire New Testament uses that word. Then look at how the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint, uses that word. And if you need to, then expand your search and see how other ancient Greek literature uses that word. But just keep in mind that when you're trying to study a passage and you want to know the meaning of a phrase or word, there are these stair steps that you should take of looking it up in the dictionary, but then examining progressively the whole book, the author's other works like it in the New Testament, the whole New Testament, and then other literature. If you do that, you'll really get a good grasp on what an individual word or phrase means in a passage. That's not to say that you need to do such a word study for every word, but especially if you're preaching or teaching a passage. In almost every passage, there's going to be one word or two words that are worth an in-depth study on, so that you know exactly what's going on. I haven't done this yet, but one word that's interested me recently is the word refuge in the Psalms. I've been reading the Psalms in my devotional times, and I'm struck by how many times the psalmists use the word refuge to refer to God, and I think there's a rich word study to be done. As you read the Bible, you're probably going to pick up on similar things, words that stand out. And to be a good student of the Bible, it's extremely important to pursue studies of those words that stand out to you and know how an author is using them in the specific passage that you're looking at. Well, I think that's about all I'm going to say to you on Stein this week. We've finished the Stein book this week, and then we head into the home stretch of the course. I hope you all will keep up your good work and focus with me for the next couple of weeks on how every book of the Bible, every passage of the Bible points to Christ. We know now how to interpret individual kinds of literature, but we can't say we've had an intro to Bible study and interpretation until we talk about how Jesus is the focus of the whole Bible. So I hope you'll stay engaged for that. And like I say, keep up the good work in this course.